Hello, my name is Eric Miller. I'm with the North Central Ohio Land Conservancy, Inc., and I've been asked to give you my views on the deep injection wells proposed for the north end of Mansfield. These wells would receive what's known as fracking waste and would pump it into a formation about 4,500 feet below Mansfield's industrial park. And in giving you my perspective on that on behalf of my organization, what we're primarily going to focus on is that the gas drilling industry that is extracting gas from deep shale formations through a process called hydraulic fracturing, or otherwise known as fracking, that industry is uniquely exempt from regulations, and its waste product is uniquely exempt from regulations. Now, because of that, and because we believe the Ohio Department of Resources does not hold that industry accountable, we are opposed to the siting of these wells, frankly, anywhere in the state of Ohio, but in particular in what amounts to our backyard here in Mansfield, Ohio. When I say they are uniquely unregulated, I mean that they are exempt as a result of the 2005 Halliburton amendments from the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and other federal environmental regulations which other industries at Mansfield's industrial park still have to answer to. So they are able to generate a stream of waste product in a way that the other industries in that park are not allowed to, because the other industries have to comply with those laws. Now, Ohio has what's called primacy, meaning that the primary enforcement of environmental laws relating to these wells has been given to the state of Ohio by the federal EPA. And so I'll now shift to the accountability that Ohio Department of Natural Resources requires of this industry, because it's essentially exempt from federal environmental laws, and it only has to comply with regulations issued by the state of Ohio through our Department of Natural Resources. So I will refer to ODNR because they're the only agency that comes into play in terms of regulating this industry. Now, my question for you, for the industry, and for ODNR is, why would anyone choose to be ignorant when they could easily and inexpensively be informed? And I want to give you some examples of that, because it's this absence of regulation and absence of accountability which is the driving force behind our opposition to these deep injection wells. Let's take the gas that you get from Columbia Gas and that you use in your home. If you have a gas leak, you will instantly detect that gas leak in your home because Columbia Gas has put an inexpensive chemical marker in its gas. And when the gas leaks, you'll smell it. You'll smell it, inform Columbia Gas, and they can promptly address their leak. They have chosen to be accountable for their product escaping. It would be equally simple for the fracking industry to make itself accountable by putting cheap chemical markers in fracking fluid before they use that fluid to pulverize rock formations well below the ground. They don't. They don't put markers in their fracking fluid. ODNR does not require it of them, and therefore it is difficult to determine when fracking fluid has escaped. We do not know what is in fracking fluid because ODNR does not require the drilling company to take random sealed samples that could be easily shipped to ODNR for testing in their lab. There's another example of ignorance through ODNR's choice. Once the frack is done and pressure is released, much of the fracking fluid flows back, and this so-called flowback water could be easily tested at the wellhead, as could gas being released at the wellhead. Then we would know what's being released into the air as part of the fracking process, and we would know what's in the fracking flowback fluid. Those tests aren't required, though they would be simple and inexpensive for the industry. The flowback fluid then lands into a holding pond. And unlike a gas station where you have to have your gas stored in sealed tanks and where the gas station is required to have leak detectors below their underground storage tanks, the fracking companies are not required to have leak detectors below their holding ponds. So they won't necessarily know instantly, and so certainly ODNR and the public aren't going to know if their holding ponds are leaking. Yet it would be easy to require such saturation detectors to inform us if these holding ponds are leaking. This again is an example of the industry and ODNR choosing ignorance over information. This causes us concern then when the same industry representatives and this same agency assures us that deep injection wells will be safe. Contrast that industry with the dairy industry, which is heavily regulated by the Department of Agriculture. You don't worry about your milk being unsafe when you buy it from the store. And that's because that industry is held accountable by the Department of Agriculture. In contrast, the fracking industry has chosen, in essence, to capture ODNR and capture those who would otherwise regulate their process and hold them accountable. We look at the process of eventually billions of gallons of water being stored beneath the north end of Mansfield, and we are concerned that that reservoir of fracking fluid will migrate to areas it doesn't belong. We don't know if it will or not, but we look at other ways this industry and its agency could provide us with transparency and accountability. And we ask ourselves, if they won't be transparent when it's inexpensive and easy to do so, why should we trust their evaluation that billions of gallons of fracking waste can be stored safely beneath our town? Finally, I'd like you to consider looking at this from a capitalistic point of view. In resisting this deep injection well, are we simply denying a job creator the opportunity to make a living on his 4.5-acre parcel of land? And are we being unfair to this job creator? Well, we would say that as a capitalist, at least if he were a capitalist who was tied to our community and wanted to prosper for the long run in our community, in that event, he would be concerned about the fresh water supply of our community, because that relates to protecting the capital investment we all have in our homes, our farms, our jobs in this community. So we think that we're taking a more capitalistic point of view than he is, and that indeed the injection of this waste below our community, injection that's been approved by an agency whose track record we reject in many respects, we consider that to be irresponsible. The fracking industry and ODNR would say that we don't have enough expertise, we don't have sufficient degrees in geology and resource management in order to appreciate the safety of what they're doing. And so, to some extent, they're right about that. We don't have their advanced degrees and training. We're forced then to look at their conduct in areas that we can understand using our common sense and evaluate the caliber of their decision making. And we can look at their decision making and decide if it's sound decision making for the long run or not. Now let's take ODNR's position this year when the legislature was considering whether to allow drilling for gas and oil in all state parks, no exceptions, and whether to allow timbering in all state parks, no exceptions. ODNR, their top people, testified at legislative hearings in favor of that policy. Now I ask you, does that show a good perspective on long-term stewardship? Sure, they have the degrees in resource management and wildlife management. Maybe you should defer to them, except when you look at that decision where they affirmatively supported drilling in state parks. You can evaluate that decision using your own common sense. So now we come back to the deep injection well for the city of Mansfield, and we know that that has been approved by the same agency that endorses timbering and fracking in Mohican Park and Malabar Farm State Park. And we ask ourselves, is that agency that would approve something as irresponsible as fracking in those parks, is that agency in a state of array such that it cannot be trusted to protect our state resources for the long run. Look at the fact that Governor Kasich over the last 10 years has received over $200,000 in contributions from the gas and oil industry in support of his political campaigns. He in turn has appointed the key officials within ODNR. So has that agency been captured by the industry it regulates? And can we trust their decision making? I don't think any of us would find their decision with respect to Malabar Farm or Mohican State Park being fracked. I don't think any of us would say that's a sound decision. And overall, are we in a situation right now where the protection of the resources of the state of Ohio are necessarily falling to the hands of the citizens because the agency charged with protecting those resources has been captured? That's the question that we're asking you to consider, and we're asking you to take action as a citizen to call upon the state to protect our resources. So, to summarize, we look at the fact that Ohio Division of Natural Resources, ODNR, could require cheap chemical markers in fracking fluid. They could require that the fluid be tested through random sampling before it's pressurized and injected into the ground at 10,000 psi or more. They could require random samples of the flowback water and the flowback gas during the time that the pressure is let off. They could require simple and inexpensive saturation detection devices that would notice if the soil beneath the holding ponds was being saturated by a leak and would set off a warning system. They could require those things. It would not be expensive for the industry to meet those requirements, and then the process would be more accountable and more transparent. Now, why has the industry and why has this agency resisted that transparency with regard to aspects of this process that we as citizens can easily understand and could readily relate to? Why have they resisted that transparency? Well, we don't have the skill as geologists to evaluate a large reservoir and growing reservoir of fracking waste below the city of Mansfield. And we don't have the technical skill to evaluate whether that will migrate into our drinking water someday. We do have enough common sense to know that easy methods of accountability are being resisted by this industry, and they have succeeded in convincing their agency to resist accountability, and that causes us concern. And that is the fundamental basis for our resistance to this proposal for a deep injection well below the north end of Mansfield. Thank you.